Margaret Connor lay propped up in her hospital bed, which had been placed in her master bedroom. The long stream of visitors had finally ended, leaving her with only her immediate family. She sighed deeply, adjusting her body to ease the constant pain. It was still manageable with the current medication, but she knew that time was running out. The simple fact was that she was dying. The doctors had sent her home with hospice care, saying it would only be a week or two before the pain would require stronger medication that would make her incoherent and cause her to sleep most of the time. If she needed to get her life in order, now was the time. She glanced over at her husband of 28 years, her eyes welling with tears as she thought of the pain she was about to inflict. Again, she questioned the wisdom of what she was about to do. Yet for her to leave this world in peace, she needed to tie up some loose ends. She had spoken with all the friends and family who had come to say goodbye. Now, only those closest to her remained. Harold, her husband, still hovered over her in the room, while she could hear Elizabeth, her little sister, along with Becky and John, her niece and nephew, in the living room. Confession, they said, was good for the soul. Maggie certainly hoped it would be. Even though it would be painful, she knew she couldn't die with so many secrets hanging over her. She prayed they would forgive her. "Sweetheart," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. "Yeah, babe," he replied, concern etched on his face, making what she had to do even harder. Seeing her tears, he quickly came to her side. "Is it the pain?" he asked gently. She nodded but looked up into his kind blue eyes. "Yes, but right now, it's not the cancer, Harold, it's my heart that's breaking." He gazed at her, puzzled, a strange expression crossing his face. She gathered herself and continued, "Dear, I need to tell you some things. Some things that will be hard to hear. Actually, I'm not strong enough to do this twice. So it would be better if I said it all at once. Could you ask Lizzie to join us?" Harold's face shifted from confusion to deep concern. "Maggie," he said quietly, but with a clear note of fear, "what are you doing, sweetheart?" "I'm trying to set things right," she replied. "I can't leave this world with this heavy burden I've been carrying. Now, please, could you get Lizzie?" He nodded and went into the living room. She could hear the muffled voices. Can I really tell them everything, she wondered. Can I break the hearts of those I love? The things she needed to say would hurt, but there was no other way to clear her conscience. She had considered writing farewell letters, but that felt cowardly. No, she would hold her head up and confess what needed to be said. Her sins seemed like they had happened a lifetime ago, but she knew they had altered many lives. It had all begun 25 years earlier, a simple slip that had snowballed into something much larger. Harold had traveled a lot in the early years of their marriage. As a low-level engineer for a construction firm, he had been sent to oversee one remote site after another. As he gained more experience, the travel had lessened to shorter visits. Maggie's career, however, had taken the opposite trajectory. Before her diagnosis, she had spent the last 15 years traveling extensively around the world as a senior trainer for a large corporation. She'd flown everywhere, training on-site technical staff. She smiled briefly, thinking of the respect and recognition she had earned over the years. She had become the strong, successful woman she had always dreamed of being. But 25 years ago, she had been none of those things. She had been a woman who had just turned 30, struggling with the occasional loneliness that many two-career marriages faced. That's when she had made her mistake. Maggie grimaced, remembering how she had tried to justify her actions, Harold's constant traveling, her own loneliness, her frustration at the time with her stalled career. They were all factors, but they were excuses, plain and simple. Harold had been a good husband, even a great one, except for the traveling. There wasn't a doubt in her mind that she had loved him throughout their marriage. He was 2 years younger than she was, and he had always joked that she liked younger men. He had never known how right he was. They had been married only 3 years when she'd been introduced to Sam. From the moment they first met, there was an intense spark between them, even though he was 5 years her junior. While Harold was good-looking and fit, Sam was ruggedly handsome and very muscular. They had been drawn to each other from that very moment. She hadn't been looking to have an affair, other than feeling lonely. She'd been very happy with her marriage, but the thought of Sam's kisses and his arms around her made her heart race and her body writhe with desire. There was another huge reason for them not to get together besides her being married. Sam was Liz's fiancé. "You stupid fool," Maggie chided herself. What kind of woman does that to her own sister? It was a question she'd asked herself countless times over the years. The answers she'd found were too painful to dwell on. Maggie had always been the dominant older sister. There had been many times growing up when Liz's adoration of her older sister had closely resembled idol worship. Where Maggie was gregarious and outgoing, Liz was more shy and reserved. Both sisters were attractive and tended to draw a lot of male attention, though the types of guys each one attracted differed. That was why Sam had caught her by surprise. She resisted her attraction to him for several months, and then Harold was sent to Florida for a very large construction project. He spent the next 3 months there, only returning home for a couple of days every 3 weeks. It was during that window that she sought company with Sam. Sam was like her in that he was a corporate ladder climber. He was confident and aggressive, and he drew her to him like a moth to a flame. Maggie scolded herself, remembering how she knew she was falling for Sam but was still in love with Harold. The turmoil she struggled with then was nothing compared to the terror she felt when she found out she was pregnant. She panicked. She and Harold had only had sex a handful of times during the probable window of conception, and she thought they'd always used precautions. She remembered using protection with Sam as well, but the frequency with her lover had been 10 times more than with her husband. Also, there had been several times the sex with Sam had been so intense that the condom had broken. She was certain the child wasn't Harold's, and that fear led her to abruptly break off her affair with Sam. Still, as guilt-ridden as she was, the only person she could confide in was Sam. It was still the early years for abortion clinics, and many had protesters and others watching over them. She'd been concerned about going to one and being recognized. It was probably an unreasonable fear, but at that time she wasn't thinking clearly. Sam convinced her to go to a less-than reputable clinic, which wasn't publicized, so there wouldn't be any questions asked and no trace of her abortion. Like a fool, she agreed. The abortion was successful, but the doctor had botched the procedure and scarred her internally. Her chances of having a baby were now next to none. It was a secret she knew couldn't be hidden. She felt a tear begin to run down her cheek as she remembered the day, a year later, when she went to their family doctor to receive the report of what she already knew: she couldn't have children. She lied to Harold and told him she'd had an abortion as a teen but never knew the damage it had done. It had almost crushed him. She remembered the tears in his eyes when he learned he would never be a natural father. It had been something he'd always dreamed of. They initially talked about adopting but had put those discussions on hold because of their careers. When they began talking about it again, fate intervened. She guessed it was karma, the universe trying to balance things out. Maggie had vowed to put the affair behind her, and Sam had agreed. For the next 2 years, they successfully focused on being just platonic friends. It was a challenge, but they both succeeded in putting their respective relationships ahead of their past desires. Their hunger for successful careers drew them even closer as friends. Sam was beginning to jump up the ladder 2 rungs at a time, and with his advice and encouragement, Maggie had found her own career beginning to blossom as well. Neither of them could have predicted the future. Sam and Liz married a couple of months after the affair. It hadn't surprised Maggie, since she knew that, even in spite of their affair, Sam really did love Liz. In many ways, they were a good match. Sam was very dominant, and her little sister had always been somewhat submissive. Only a year and a half into their marriage, Liz fell into a deep depression. She had struggled with depression throughout her teenage years, but this was much more severe. She lost interest in everything around her and seemed to crawl back into herself. There was even a fear she might harm herself, and she had been put on suicide watch twice. She was eventually diagnosed with clinical depression. Her desire for sex or intimacy had greatly diminished, and the medication she was put on reduced it even further. Frustrated, Sam had confided in Maggie about the lack of intimacy in his marriage. Foolishly, she tried to console him, and soon they found themselves falling back into their affair while Harold was out of town. Over the next 21 months, their relationship deepened into what felt like a true love affair. Even when Lizzie recovered from her depression and resumed a closer relationship with Sam, the affair continued. Maggie's only defense was that she was in love with both men. During the affair, she hadn't withdrawn from Harold. In fact, she tried to give him even more of herself. Naturally, her relationship with her sister became a convoluted mess. As the dominant older sister, Maggie had always led their dynamic, but now she was drowning in guilt and shame, trying not to draw any attention. Things became even more complicated when Lizzie announced she was pregnant. Maggie's initial reaction was a mixture of jealousy and remorse, but she managed to explain it as sadness over her own inability to have children. Her emotional turmoil was tearing her apart. The overwhelming guilt of betraying both her husband and her sister brought her to the brink of confession many times. However, fate stepped in again, this time twisting its cruel knife. Maggie had recently begun traveling frequently, even if it was only to smaller sites. One week, she was in Philadelphia. Sam, who traveled sporadically, happened to be in Pittsburgh for a conference at the same time. It was easy for him to take an extra day and meet her at her hotel. Maggie and Sam had always been very discreet, taking extra steps to ensure that no one discovered or even suspected their affair. Even when meeting out of town, they acted as if someone could be watching. To avoid suspicion, Sam left Maggie's hotel room in the middle of the night. It wasn't until later that day she learned Sam had been in a hit-and-run accident when he returned to Pittsburgh. He was in critical condition at a hospital there. Maggie shook her head slowly and sighed. Everything changed after that. Sam's world turned into a nightmare, and it threatened to drag her down with it. Maggie was horrified when she first visited him. Physically, he was a mass of cuts, bruises, and broken bones, but Maggie knew those would eventually heal. However, Sam had two other injuries that wouldn't. Tragically, he had broken his back and was now partially paralyzed from the waist down. He'd also sustained a severe head injury, leading to a diagnosis of moderate traumatic brain injury. While it wasn't noticeable in his speech, his memory was clouded at times, and he struggled to control his emotions. Sam spent the next 2 months in a rehab hospital, and when he was released, he wasn't the same man. Between the trauma from his accident and being confined to a wheelchair, Maggie watched as he emotionally ricocheted from bitterness to anger to deep depression. The confident, sometimes arrogant man who had been her lover was now a shadow of his former self. Over the following months, her pregnant sister hovered over him, and Maggie had to limit her role to that of a concerned sister-in-law. She painfully watched as her lover became more and more dependent on his wife, and she quickly realized Sam's love for Lizzie was growing stronger as a result. When Maggie finally had a private conversation with Sam, they both agreed their affair had ended. They parted, vowing never to reveal their indiscretions to their spouses. Unfortunately, with his physical and emotional struggles, Sam's career suffered dramatically. Although his company didn't abandon him, his rapid advancement had left him with few friends and many enemies. It soon became clear that his upward mobility in the company had stalled. This realization plunged Sam into even deeper despair, and he clung to Lizzie like a drowning man to a life preserver. It was painful for Maggie to watch Sam fade away, but there was one positive outcome: her once shy and reserved sister was coming into her own. By the time Becky was born, it was obvious that Lizzie and Sam would need extra help. With insurance money, savings, and Sam's large inheritance, they were able to buy the house across the street. Sam's parents had given him his inheritance early to ensure his needs were met, especially the expenses insurance wouldn't cover. Initially, Maggie and Harold visited daily. Maggie helped Lizzie with Becky and household chores, while Harold took care of the things Sam could no longer do around the house. Over the next 2 years, Maggie watched Sam's personality weaken while her sister blossomed. Lizzie was a naturally nurturing mother and wife, looking after both Becky and Sam with the intensity of a hawk. In some ways, Maggie thought she might have been smothering Sam with her overprotectiveness, but the alternative of having someone else care for him wasn't an option. Harold had begun traveling less and was able to spend more time helping them. Maggie's career, on the other hand, was taking off, and she started traveling much more. One of the side benefits was that her husband got to play Uncle Harry with the baby, which helped ease Maggie's conscience as she focused more on her work. Maggie couldn't shake the shame she felt as she remembered how, in that last year, she had spent less and less time around Sam. He wasn't the man she had fallen in love with, the man for whom she'd risked her marriage and her relationship with her sister. He had become sad and withdrawn, and she wasn't sure why she avoided him, but suspected she had finally realized how foolish she had been to think they were soulmates. As she began to distance herself from Sam and Lizzie's home, she encouraged Harold to spend more time there when he wasn't traveling. It gave her some peace knowing he was helping in her place. In hindsight, it was probably unwise. She hadn't considered the impact it might have on Sam, seeing the man he'd been overshadowed by for years doing the things around the house that Sam no longer could. It must have contributed to the way things turned out. When Maggie learned that Sam had taken his own life, she was more saddened than surprised. Lizzie was naturally devastated, first because she lost her husband, and second because she had just found out she was pregnant. Maggie had been aware that Sam's paralysis had affected certain aspects of his life, but was surprised to learn it hadn't impacted his ability to conceive. Lizzie had lamented that if Sam had known about the baby, he might not have taken his life, but Maggie doubted it. It had been clear that Sam simply couldn't cope with no longer being the alpha in his world. After Sam's death, both Maggie and Harold ensured Lizzie and Becky were well taken care of. Though Sam's life insurance didn't pay out due to his suicide, his inheritance allowed Lizzie to stay home and look after her children for several years. There had been discussions about whether Lizzie and Becky should move in with them, but Maggie wasn't enthusiastic about the idea. With Sam gone, Maggie feared Lizzie and Harold might become too close. While she trusted they would never cross any inappropriate boundaries, having a relationship more like brother and sister, there was no need to tempt fate. By that time, Maggie had poured herself into strengthening her marriage, and the effort was paying off. She and Harold had settled into a comfortable two-career, child-free life. Maggie wished for those same good things for her sister. It wasn't until nearly a year after John was born that Lizzie began dating again, though infrequently at first. Lizzie, having grown in confidence through motherhood, eventually started looking for a new husband. The man she chose shocked Maggie. His name was Jim, and he lived in another state. Lizzie had met him through a dating service. What stunned Maggie was that Jim was still married, though separated from his wife for years. His legal and financial situation meant he wouldn't be divorced anytime soon because of his young children. Maggie was astounded by how much her sister had changed in recent years. Her once timid and reserved sister was now colder and more assertive. When Maggie questioned Lizzie about the future of her relationship with Jim, Lizzie had explained that, due to his circumstances, they had agreed to keep their families at arm's length. Lizzie also mentioned that Harold was an excellent male role model for Becky and John, so there wasn't a need for Jim to be involved in that part of her life. Lizzie told Maggie she was content to let Harold continue being the father figure for her children, while Jim fulfilled other needs in her life. Reluctantly, Maggie agreed, partially out of guilt and partially because Harold absolutely adored his niece and nephew. That's when the cycle they had been in for the last 18 years began. Lizzie maintained her romantic relationship with Jim on the side, Harold embraced his role as a father figure to her kids, and Maggie focused on her career and marriage. Most times when Lizzie spent a weekend with Jim, either Maggie or Harold would agree to watch the children. As her business travel increased, it was Harold who more often stepped in, though he didn't mind. He loved spending time with Lizzie's kids. Maggie couldn't help but smile to herself when she thought of Jim. She had only met him a few times over the years, but she had to admit he was handsome, even though he was several years older than Lizzie. Over the years, Jim and Lizzie seemed to have maintained a steady, though distant, relationship. A sharp pain suddenly brought Maggie back to the present, and she grimaced until it passed. She and Harold had built a good life together, they had been happy, and she had done her best to be a good wife after Sam's death. She loved Harold with all her heart and had never strayed again, despite the opportunities that arose during her travels. She also knew he loved her deeply, and it was that love she was counting on to help him forgive her. Her sister's forgiveness, however, was another matter. Maggie knew Lizzie would likely hate her at first, but she hoped her actions over the past 20 years would count for something. She prayed that family bonds would prove stronger than the pain of her betrayal. Maggie had decided she would tell them both at the same time. She didn't have the strength to go through it twice, and she thought maybe they could find the strength to forgive her together. It wasn't the first time the thought of Harold and Lizzie eventually becoming a couple had crossed her mind. She wondered if they would ever dare to cross the boundary from their sibling-like relationship to something more romantic after her death. Maggie still wasn't sure how she felt about that. She was torn between wanting to ensure Harold was cared for after she was gone and the jealousy of imagining him with another woman. Selfish to the end, huh, she scolded herself. This will be my final act of penance, encouraging the two of them to move beyond the sibling barrier and find comfort in each other. She knew Harold would be devastated by her passing, and seeking solace in her sister's company didn't seem far-fetched. Lizzie's relationship with Jim had cooled dramatically over the years. When his children were finally old enough to leave home, he decided against pursuing a divorce. Lizzie hadn't mentioned Jim or gone to see him in over a year, shortly after Maggie's cancer diagnosis. Since then, Lizzie and her kids had spent much of their time around Maggie and Harold, for which Maggie was truly grateful. They had been a godsend to both her and her husband. The bedroom door creaked open, and Harold cautiously entered. Behind him came the cheerful voices of Becky and John. "Bye, Aunt Maggie," they called from the other room. "We'll be back soon," Becky added. "See you later, Harry," they both chimed as the front door closed. Maggie stifled a laugh. She knew her husband hated being called Harry and always corrected anyone who used it, except for Becky and John. With them, he never complained. It had been their nickname for him since they were little, and even Lizzie had eventually started calling him Harry. Maggie once asked Lizzie about it, and her sister had explained that she used the name at first to avoid confusing her small children at the time, but also to tease Harold. Maggie had understood and laughed, though she swore to herself she would never call him that. To her, Harold would always be H. Now, Harold stood at the foot of the bed while Lizzie sat beside Maggie, holding her hand. Maggie gazed at them both, smiling. Harold was still a handsome man, even at 53, and Maggie had aged gracefully into a beautiful woman at 51. "I wanted to talk to you both before my condition worsens," Maggie said gently. "It won't be long before I'm struggling just to speak or to keep my thoughts clear. Before that happens, I need to confess something." "Maggie, please don't," Harold interrupted quietly, his voice thick with emotion. She looked at him, and her heart ached. She had always known he suspected something between her and Sam, but his doubts only surfaced after Sam's death. She believed he never confronted her because he loved her too much and knew Sam was never a threat to their marriage. Maggie had often wondered if Sam had ever hinted at their affair, but she dismissed the thought. If he had, Harold would have surely approached Lizzie, and Lizzie would have undoubtedly confronted her. It had taken Maggie years before she was confident that Harold knew there was no one in her life but him. She had demonstrated her commitment through her actions, careful not to draw any unwanted attention. Over time, Maggie knew that Harold didn't doubt her love for him. Now, however, she could see the frustration building in her husband. He clearly wanted to avoid this conversation. It was typical of him. He disliked confrontation, and when he did address issues, it was always in a cold, businesslike manner. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said gently. "I need the truth to come out, and I'm running out of time." "Please," Harold said, his voice stern. "Let the past stay in the past." "Hal, I need to do this," she replied, trying not to sound condescending. "I don't want to leave this world with these secrets between the three of us." "Damn it, Maggie," he snapped. "I'm begging you. Leave it alone." His emotional outburst caught her off guard, but her need to unburden herself of the guilt she had carried for years overrode his protests. "I'm sorry, Hal. I can't do that." Maggie looked over at her little sister, feeling her heart tighten. Lizzie's face was full of both dread and anticipation. Of course, Maggie thought. She's not stupid either. Naturally, Lizzie had suspected something. Maggie gathered her resolve and continued. "They say the truth will set you free." Maggie prayed they were right. "I'm so very, very sorry." Maggie's voice cracked with emotion, "but I have to ask both of you for your forgiveness. Years ago, I betrayed you both. Over 20 years ago, I had an affair. An affair with Sam." She had prepared herself, but the pain on her sister's and husband's faces still broke her heart. Lizzie couldn't look at her, and Harold kept his eyes fixed on her. She didn't know which reaction hurt more. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to ask this," Maggie said softly, tears filling her eyes, "but I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me." Her husband stared at her with an expression that made her question whether confessing had been the right thing. Lizzie released her hand and buried her face in her own hands. A terrible silence filled the room until Harold's calm voice shattered it. Why? He asked quietly. I'm sorry, Hal, Maggie said gently. I wish my reasons were better, but they're not. I was lonely and foolish. I thought I was in love with him. I knew it was wrong, but I believed he was my soulmate. That's not what I meant, Harold responded coldly. I meant, why are you doing this now? Why bring all this pain up? I'm sorry, Maggie said, her voice trembling, but I needed to do this. I needed to ask for your forgiveness before it was too late. What about our needs? Harold asked, his voice shaking with emotion. What about what Lizzie and I needed? Maggie stared at them helplessly. Lizzie looked up at her, tears streaming down her cheeks. All I want to know is how, Lizzie said through her tears. How could you do that to me? Maggie sighed deeply and wiped her eyes. I'm sorry, Lizzie. I have no excuse for being such a terrible sister. I can only say that when we first got together, it was before you were married. Lizzie hissed, we were engaged. He was already mine. Why did you need to take him from me? And you were married, weren't you? Yes, Maggie whispered, glancing guiltily at Harold. I know you won't believe me, but I truly thought Sam and I were destined to be together. I knew our actions would hurt others, but I believed it was fate. I'm so very sorry. She looked back at her husband, who was clearly wrestling with a mixture of anger and hurt. I'm so sorry, Hal, but it's true. I was in love with both you and Sam. I've always loved you, Hal, but at the time, I thought Sam was my soulmate. As the years passed, I realized Sam and I were more like kindred spirits. If I had realized that sooner, we could have remained good friends instead of becoming lovers. As it was, I ended up betraying both you and Lizzie. I know it may not seem like it now, but I've always loved you. Lizzie snorted in disgust, and Harold sighed deeply. I believe you, he said solemnly, much to Maggie's surprise. I believe you loved us both, but I don't think your love for Sam was something that just happened. It wasn't love at first sight. A love like that takes time. It takes heart-to-heart conversations and multiple shared moments to bond two people. It takes a conscious effort. You had to choose to make time for him, and that's what's hard for me to forgive. It's something I've never forgotten. Maggie wiped away her tears, her eyes pleading as she looked at her husband. She nodded slowly. I felt like you suspected something a long time ago, she said softly. I noticed it after Sam died. But Hal, he was never a threat to you. After his death, he wasn't even part of my thoughts. Since then, I've been a good and faithful wife. I've never strayed again, even though I've had countless opportunities while I was traveling. I never cheated on you. If you say so, Maggie, he replied quietly. But since you've basically lied to me for the past 20 years by not confessing your affair, you'll understand why I'm having trouble believing you. Even if you've done what you say, it doesn't undo your affair with Sam, now does it? Like I said, it was hard to forgive you, but I could never forget. What? What do you mean? What I mean is that I knew about the two of you well before his death. I knew about your affair even before his accident. Please, Hal, Maggie pleaded, her voice trembling. Please tell me you didn't have anything to do with Sam's accident. Well, I can truthfully say the importance of my role is somewhat subjective, depending on who's asking. I like to think of my involvement as indirectly responsible for his misfortune. Oh, how? How could you? Well, Maggie, the same question could be asked of both of you. What did Lizzie or I ever do to deserve your betrayal? Maggie was silent as tears streamed down her face. Slowly, her brow furrowed as the question formed in her mind. But how? How did you find out? I told him, Lizzie interjected in a cold voice. Maggie gasped. You knew? Yes, Lizzie said, drying her eyes. But when? How? Lizzie looked over at Harold, as if searching for a sign or permission. Apparently, she received it when Harold grimaced and nodded. Well, Lizzie continued, we decided not to air everything, hoping you'd die in peace with your secrets. However, you chose to open Pandora's box, and I guess everything will come out now. I'm sorry to start, but I found out about you sleeping with my husband only a year and a half into my marriage. No. Maggie gasped in horror. Oh God, No. Why do you think I fell into such a deep depression? Lizzie asked calmly. That's what happens when you find out two of the people you trust most in life are betraying you. Learning my husband had slept with my older sister while we were engaged almost crushed me. Maggie buried her face in her hands and wept. I never knew. Of course, you didn't. You were so damn selfish. It was always about you, even when we were growing up. Lizzie glared at her sister, waiting to see if there would be a response. When there wasn't, she continued. I came so close to giving up back then. I was alone since I was afraid to approach Harry about it. The reason for my fear was because if he already knew, I would have completely lost it. Having all three of the people I loved most betray me would have been too much. I tried to hold on to the fact that this had happened before we were married. It was weak, but at least it was something. I finally worked myself out of my depression and began to try to heal my marriage. Like a fool, I didn't confront the two of you at the time. Instead, I spent the next 6 months fighting to restore my marriage. Imagine my surprise when I found out my sister was sharing my husband's bed again. That's when I started leaving a small recorder in our bedroom, as well as in yours and Harry's bedroom whenever he traveled. It didn't take long before I had the evidence of your affair. I was torn between despair and anger when I realized I'd been in competition with my sister for my husband's affections for the past 16 months. When I felt myself starting to fall back into my depression, I finally confronted Harry. I'm ashamed to say I was relieved when I found out he was as clueless as I had been. I found an ally, and it gave me the strength to hang on. Harry was a godsend. With his friendship and support, I was able to keep from falling apart again. Maggie's forlorn face gave way to shock and realization. She stared at her husband and tried to stifle a sob. But, you knew? Even before, she whispered. You never said anything. No. I started to, but Lizzie reminded me how unprotected I was, both financially and otherwise. It took a little while to get things in place, but I eventually got those things covered. I talked to a colleague from work who had gone through an ugly divorce recently, and he helped me set up an offshore account to start moving any loose or hard-to-trace funds into. When I was ready, I was prepared to confront both of you. But then Lizzie stopped me. Stopped you? Maggie asked weakly, confusion plain on her face as she turned to stare at her little sister. Why? Simple, Lizzie replied. If we had confronted you back then, there would have been 2 divorces. Afterwards, you and Sam would likely have gotten together, so the only ones really losing anything would have been Harry and me. So, I proposed an alternative to confronting you, Lizzie said, glancing over at Harold with a sheepish smile. Harold shook his head slowly, trying to hide a small grin. Maggie stared at her husband in shock and horror. Sorry, sweetheart, Harold said, his face starting to redden, but it was quite the proposal. If it makes you feel better, sister, Lizzie interjected, Harry really struggled with my proposition, at least initially. But when he heard some of my recordings of your meetings with Sam, he eventually relented. I know hearing you profess your love for him countless times kept some ember of hope alive within him. However, listening to you declare your love for Sam, and other things, was the final blow. I'm certain that was what convinced him to agree to my idea for revenge. Maggie lay there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, her mind racing as she began connecting the dots. Lizzie continued, as if she were calmly reporting facts. What Harry and I had back then was more of a close, casual relationship. I'm not sure how long it would have lasted, but then I ran into the same issue you did. I turned up pregnant and didn't know whether the child was my husband's or someone else's. Maggie gasped. You knew, she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks again. Yes. You mentioned it a few times during the recordings, Lizzie explained. I was cautious about how Sam might react, so when I brought it up, I only said there was a possibility. He reacted very strangely. A couple of days later, I told him it was a false alarm. I saw him visibly relax. He may have forgotten about his reaction, but I didn't. Later that week, I called his mother. Sam's parents were living in France at the time. His family was never close, but I asked if she knew whether Sam liked children. She said she thought he did, but doubted he'd ever agree to adopt any. She also mentioned that Sam had told them you two had already discussed this before marriage, that there wouldn't be any children because he was sterile. Sterile? Maggie gasped in horror. Yes, it seems he had complications from a childhood illness. But? Maggie stammered, her face growing pale. That would mean... Yes, Harold interrupted coldly, that would mean you ended our child's life to cover up your affair, and Sam, your so-called soulmate, knew the child wasn't his. No. God, no. Maggie wailed. Oh God, please no. She curled up into a ball, wrapping her arms around her legs as her heart shattered. It felt like the air had been pulled from her lungs. No, her heart screamed, but deep down, she knew it was true. How could Sam do that to me? Oh God, what must Hal think of me? He must have hated me, Maggie thought as she struggled to breathe, tears pouring down her face. She stared silently at her husband, her expression full of shame. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't know. That was the other thing, Harold continued, ignoring her apology, which eventually pushed me into Lizzie's arms. Both Harold and Lizzie silently watched as Maggie sobbed, a wide range of emotions flickering across their faces: pity, compassion, guilt, anger, and pain. Harold broke the silence. So, then we had a problem. Lizzie was actually pregnant with Becky, and Sam would soon realize it. How he would react was anyone's guess, but it was sure to be explosive, especially since everything was about to be exposed. That's when I made some decisions and calls. Sam eventually did confront Lizzie, and she countered by throwing his affair and sterility back at him. She lied about who the father was, claiming it had been a one-time mistake. She also told him that if he revealed anything, she would confront you and destroy any hope he had of being with you. Lizzie threatened to tell me, too, knowing I'd seek revenge if I found out. That bought us a little time, Lizzie added. It wasn't much, and obviously it didn't stop him from continuing his relationship with you. But then you both went to Pennsylvania, and Sam had his accident, and your affair ended. Maggie's eyes widened. You tried to have Sam killed, she choked out. No, Harold said calmly. I asked that your affair be ended without you being harmed. The specifics weren't important. I was surprised when the accident happened, and even more so by the result. How could you? Maggie stammered. If you're asking how I could do something like that to him, please, you've got to be joking. Let's see, he claimed to be my caring brother-in-law while betraying my sister-in-law and my loving wife behind my back. He played a major role in the tragedy of losing our unborn child. How could I not feel compelled to take action against him? Can you understand now why I had no problem with whether he lived or died? Maggie closed her eyes, beginning to grasp the repercussions her affair had on her husband and sister. It was her and Sam's betrayal that had damaged both of them, transforming who they were. Hal's calm voice pulled her from her realization. If you're asking about the logistics, it wasn't difficult. I simply moved a bit of money from my offshore account and made a couple of promises to undercharge for services on specific construction projects to cover the costs. Maggie frowned, surprised. Don't look so shocked. Every person who has ever worked in construction has encountered people who claim to know someone who knows someone. The truth is, a few of them actually do. Lizzie gently continued, when Sam got out of the hospital, we all knew he wasn't the same. He was physically broken and emotionally fragile. He lied to my face, swearing your affair had ended before he went to Pittsburgh. He insisted he wanted to work on our marriage if I aborted my baby. I told him that since he was sterile, I was keeping the child but agreed to never tell anyone the truth. I also warned him that if he ever told you, I'd do everything I could to ruin what was left of his life. You see, sister, he did love you, but I made sure to emphasize that you would never be with him again once you learned of his part in your loss. He asked me why I didn't want you or Harry to know, and I explained that if he told you, I would be forced to confront both of you, risking losing a sister and a brother-in-law. I wasn't willing to take that chance because I still needed you both. Reluctantly, he agreed. Afterward, Harry helped me tie up our finances. We locked up most of Sam's and my money to prevent him from using it as leverage in a divorce. This started several months of hell for us as we tried to determine if there was any reason to save our marriage. I knew Sam still hoped for it, but I was certain it wouldn't work. I was just trying to figure out what to do next. Sam continued to recover slowly from his accident, but it was difficult for him. He struggled to watch my pregnancy progress after Becky was born. It was painful for him to even hold her. I think we both realized things would never be okay between us again. My problem was I couldn't get over his betrayal, especially since it had been with my sister. Complicating matters, I began to develop strong feelings for your husband. By that time, our revenge had ended after the accident. I wanted to continue, but Harry still loved you, so we decided to focus on our respective marriages until after Becky was born. Things for Sam were quickly spiraling downward. His work started falling apart, and our marriage was deteriorating. He desperately tried to hang on, but it was a losing battle. Then, when Becky was about 5 months old, Sam figured out who the father was. Maybe it was the way Harry looked at Becky or the way I looked at Harry, but Sam noticed and connected the dots. It was then that Sam made a huge mistake. He confronted both of us and threatened to tell you. I'm not sure if it was his ego, his anger, or just plain foolishness, but he began to taunt Harry, bragging about his part in your loss. Whatever small restraint Harry had until then completely vanished. That night, Sam almost drowned in our bathtub. We told everyone he had tried to stand and accidentally fallen, but the truth was that Harry had dumped him out of his wheelchair into the tub. Maggie stared in disbelief, unable to reconcile that her gentle husband could act so violently. Harold looked uncomfortable, guilt evident on his face as he glanced at his wife. I'm not proud of what I did back then, he said softly, looking embarrassed. I was filled with a rage I'd always tried to hide from you, but Sam unleashed it that night. Thank God Lizzie was there. She was screaming at me not to kill him as I held his head under the water. She finally got through to me, and I pulled him out of the tub. He was choking, gasping, and crying. I told him that if he said one word, I'd finish it and make sure it looked like his other accident. I could see in his eyes the realization of what I just said. I'm sure he knew I would follow through on my threat. After that, things got, well, strange, Harold said hesitantly. What do you mean strange? Maggie asked, her brow furrowing. Well, Harold began, after that, we sort of, well. What he's trying to say, Lizzie interjected calmly, is that we restarted our arrangement. This time, I made no effort to hide it from Sam. Maggie gasped. You didn't, Lizzie? I sure did. He deserved it, and you both did. But Harry still loved you and was protecting you, so all my rage and pain were directed at my cheating husband. He begged me to stop, but I reminded him he had cheated on me for years, and I planned to continue for a while. I told him that at the end of that time, we'd decide if either of us wanted to try to save whatever was left of our marriage. I truly believe that hope was the only thing keeping him going in those last few months. Unfortunately, when I told him I was pregnant again and that Harry was the father, he realized we were done. Yes, he knew about John. About a week after I broke the news to him, he waited for me to take Becky with me to the store and took his own life. If he hadn't, I'm not sure how our lives would have been different. For Lizzie's part, Harold added, we made sure she and the kids were taken care of. We unfroze her family finances, including Sam's inheritance, which was originally intended for his long-term care. Combined with the funds I was diverting into my offshore account, it easily allowed her to stay home with the kids for many years. How did you divert the money? Maggie asked. Well, that was actually pretty easy. With both our salaries, we certainly weren't struggling financially, so there was never a good reason for you to look too closely. I didn't touch any of your individual investments but filtered most of mine, along with any bonuses and raises, into my offshore account. You were so focused on your career that you never really asked why my raises and bonuses were so low. When Becky and John were old enough for school, I arranged for Lizzie to be hired as a consultant by one of the companies I'd worked with. It gave her flexible hours to use her degree, and since her pay was supplemented by my offshore account, it was equivalent to a full-time salary. Between that and their inheritance, they were set for life. My turn, Lizzie interrupted. She cleared her throat and threw a sweet smile at Harold, who snorted a muffled laugh in response. With my finances taken care of, Lizzie began softly, I was able to focus on the chaos of my personal life. Things became very complicated during my pregnancy with John. Besides my feelings for Harry, they began to evolve into something deeper. It wasn't a revenge affair anymore. Harry had started to care for me more than just as a friend. Maggie quickly looked back and forth between her sister and husband. Her question was evident, hovering on the tip of her tongue, but she was terrified to voice it. You see, sweetheart, Harold said gently, I really do understand when you said you were in love with both Sam and me. I found myself feeling the same way. Of course, I would have never allowed myself to fall in love with Lizzie if I hadn't learned about your betrayal first. Regardless, I was faced with a dilemma. I was beginning to care deeply for Lizzie, but I still loved you. Even though you had torn my heart out with your affair, I wasn't ready to give up on us. Maggie gasped at the bluntness of his statement. She had never seriously considered that Harold might have divorced her if her affair had been exposed. Such thoughts had always been quickly dismissed in her mind. Harold's voice drew her attention back to the situation. I think hearing you confess your love for me, even while you were cheating, gave me some twisted hope that our marriage was worth salvaging. Unfortunately, there was no way I'd ever leave Lizzie or the kids. It wasn't ideal, and it was probably even cowardly, but I chose to solve the problem by doing nothing. I continued to love you both. I can't explain it, but I've always been grateful that Lizzie seemed to accept my feelings. At first, I expected she'd go find someone else after John was born, someone who could love her exclusively. Oh, I tried, Lizzie laughed sadly. I tried, but my heart kept bringing me back to Harry. So after a year, I told Harry I'd take whatever part of him he could give me. That's when we came up with Jim, Maggie asked quietly. Jim wasn't real, Lizzie replied. Oh, Jim was real, Harold said, smiling. He was a client of mine from Washington. He owed me a favor and was willing to pretend to be Lizzie's boyfriend during the rare times he was in town visiting my company. I know he and his husband thought it was hilarious for him to pretend to have a girlfriend, but your visits? Maggie whispered, obviously both physically and emotionally spent on those occasions. When Harry was out of town and you were watching the kids, I would join him wherever he was, and we'd spend some quality time together. More often than not, though, Harry would come over, and we'd share family moments. The children? Maggie stammered. They didn't know. Not at first, Lizzie replied softly. Oh, they suspected. Harry acted like a father, and they even began calling him Daddy. We quickly put a stop to that by having them call him Harry instead. So every time one of them called him Harry, it was almost like they were calling him Daddy. Maggie felt her stomach churn, nausea washing over her. She briefly considered the irony of the situation, wanting to scream but feeling too weak. She watched in horror as the train wreck that was her marriage continued to unfold. As they got older, Lizzie continued, they suspected our family wasn't like most. I told them Harry was their father, and you and I were like their mothers. That worked for many years until they became teenagers. Even though they had already guessed it, we told them the whole truth after their 18th birthday. Surprisingly, neither of them had as many issues as we feared since Harry had always been their father in a way. How long did your affair last? Maggie asked weakly as she gathered herself. Lizzie stared at her, dumbfounded. Harold sighed deeply. Maggie, he said gently, it never ended. My love for Lizzie is just as strong, if not stronger, than it was all those years ago. In fact, not to be callous, but we plan to marry after your passing. The kids are looking to legally change their last names as well. I'm sorry, Maggie. We really had planned on not telling you. We hoped your passing would be as peaceful as possible, but now that doesn't seem likely. Lizzie, she interjected. I still loved you, even with your betrayal. My betrayal is equally as horrible. You asked if I could forgive you, and the answer is yes, but I can't forget. Because of that, I justify the things I did back then, things I'm ashamed of. I'm ashamed of how my relationship with Harry began, but not for how much I love him now. I love you, Maggie, even with what you did. I still love you. I also love Harry. In the end, I loved you both enough to share him with you, just like you said earlier. Maggie, Harold added gently, I love you both. I hope you've had a good life, one full of love and success. I've tried to support your desire for a career and make you feel loved over the years. You asked us to forgive you earlier, and I can honestly say we have. But your affair changed the dynamics of our marriage dramatically. Now the question is, can you forgive us? Maggie sat stunned, her world crumbling around her. The things she had once believed were unshakably true or false now seemed uncertain. Her heart raced, and her breathing became labored as she struggled to process what she had been told. Then she heard Harold's soft voice drawing her attention. Maggie. She looked up to see her husband and sister. Harold stood behind Lizzie, wrapping his arms around her as Lizzie wiped away any remaining tears from her eyes. I'm sorry you wouldn't listen and chose to ignore all of this. We tried to avoid it, but we realize we've had 20 years to learn to forgive you. You have less than a few weeks. We're going to go into the living room and let you think, Lizzie said as she stood up, following Harold out of the room. The fact that they were holding hands didn't escape Maggie's notice. Lizzie turned back toward her sister. Call us if you need to talk or if you come to any decisions, she said sadly. Maggie curled up into a ball and wept, her soul feeling as though it had been torn from her body by the pain in her heart. This wasn't how she expected things to go. The truth, in all its ugliness, was exposed. The dying woman now faced a harsh dilemma. Could she forgive those she had just asked to forgive her? Even more distressing was the realization that in a week or two, it wouldn't even matter. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.